My son-in-law thinks a successful man is one who carries a country club membership card and wears suits cut by some tailor on Madison Avenue. He thinks success smells like cologne and sounds like the click of a keyboard in a glass office 40 floors above the street. For 7 years now, every time he sat at my Thanksgiving table, I could see it in the way his eyes moved across my walls, the way they lingered on my work boots by the door, the way he smiled when I talked about welding pipe back in the Bethlehem yards. A polite smile, the kind of smile a man gives a child who's just told him about an imaginary friend. But life has a way of teaching a man what he refuses to learn on his own. And sometimes it teaches him in the dark, in the cold, with the wind howling outside and his wife crying in the next room. That's what I want to tell you about tonight. The night the storm came down off the Atlantic and turned everything my son-in-law believed about himself and about me on its head. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 68 years old, and I live alone in a small wood frame house on a back road outside the town of Strasburg, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I built most of this house with my own 2 hands and the hands of my father. Back in the summer of 1978, when my wife Margaret was pregnant with our daughter Sarah, and we couldn't afford to keep renting the apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, my father, Henry Hayes, was a railroad machinist for the Pennsylvania Railroad for 41 years before they retired him. He taught me how to read a level, how to set a corner stud, how to mix mortar so it didn't crack in the first frost. He also taught me how to weld, though I didn't know it would become my whole life when he first put the torch in my hand. I welded high-pressure pipe for 43 years. Started at Bethlehem Steel in '75, when the mills were still running hot. Moved into pipeline work in the '80s when steel started dying. Did some shutdown work at 3 nuclear plants. Spent 6 winters up on the North Slope of Alaska, doing emergency repairs on the Trans-Alaska Line when the cold made the steel sing in a way that would scare a younger man. I retired 3 years ago, on my 65th birthday, with a pension that pays the property tax and a Social Security check that covers everything else if I'm careful. And I am careful. A man who grew up the son of a railroad machinist learns to be careful with money the way other men learn to be careful with fire. My wife Margaret passed 6 years ago this coming February. Pancreatic cancer. She fought it for 14 months, and on the last morning, she squeezed my hand and told me to keep the bird feeder full because the chickadees were counting on us. Those were her last words. About chickadees. I still keep that feeder full, every morning, in every weather. It's the smallest promise I've ever made and the hardest one to keep, because every time I scoop the seed out of the bin in the garage, I hear her voice. The morning this story really begins was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, 2 days before the storm. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, black, the way I've taken it since I was 19 years old, and the foreman at the mill told me cream was for accountants. The light coming through the window over the sink was that pale, low November light that makes everything look older than it is. The fields out behind the house were already dusted with the first real snow of the season, and I could see the wind moving the dry corn stubble in long waves, like a tide. My phone rang on the counter. I let it ring twice, the way I always do, because I don't trust a man who answers on the first ring. It was Sarah, my daughter. 34 years old now. Though I still hear her at 6 in the back of my head every time I see her name come up on the screen. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, sweetheart." She told me they were still coming for Thanksgiving. Her, Daniel, and my grandson Eli. She'd already bought the pie from the place on Route 30 that I like. The one that does the apple with the lattice top. Daniel had a meeting Wednesday morning, but they'd be at the house by 2 on Thursday. She asked if I needed anything. I told her I had everything I needed and that I'd already pulled the turkey out of the freezer and put it in the fridge to thaw. She laughed a little at that and said, "Daddy, you don't have to cook the whole thing yourself." I told her I wanted to. I didn't tell her why. The truth is, I cook a turkey every Thanksgiving because Margaret used to, and because if I don't cook a turkey, then the day becomes just another day, and I'm not ready for that. Maybe I'll never be ready for that. Some promises a man makes to himself and never explains, not even to his own daughter. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time with the phone in my hand, looking out the window at the corn stubble, and I thought about Daniel. I should tell you about Daniel Whitmore now, because you can't understand this story without understanding him. And the truth is, for 7 years, I've been trying to understand him myself. He's 36 years old, tall, lean. The kind of lean that comes from a personal trainer and not from work. He grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, the only son of a corporate lawyer and a woman who sat on the board of 3 charities and never, as far as I can tell, cooked her own dinner. He went to one of those New England boarding schools where the boys wear ties at breakfast, then to Princeton, then to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He met my daughter in Philadelphia at a benefit for the Art Museum. Sarah was working as a curator's assistant. Daniel was there because his firm had bought a table. I'll say this for him. He fell in love with my daughter the right way. Honest and fast and all the way through. The first time he came home with her to meet me, he stood in my driveway in a pair of leather shoes that probably cost more than my truck. And he shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said, "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to take care of her." And I believed him. I still believe him. Whatever else this story is going to say about Daniel Whitmore, I want you to know that part first. But here's the thing about a man raised in a world of glass towers and offshore accounts and dinner parties, where everyone has the same kind of watch. He learns to measure other men by certain numbers. Not all numbers. Certain numbers. Salary. Square footage. The make of a car. The school on a diploma. He doesn't do it to be cruel. Half the time he doesn't even know he's doing it. But the measuring is always running. Somewhere behind his eyes. Like a clock that won't stop ticking. The first Thanksgiving they came here, the year before they got married. Daniel walked into my house and I could see his eyes doing the measuring. He looked at the linoleum floor in the kitchen. He looked at the wood paneling in the living room that my father and I put up in 1980. He looked at the wedding photo of me and Margaret on the mantel, and at the photo of my parents next to it. My father in his railroad overalls and my mother holding a casserole dish. And I saw something flicker across his face. Not contempt. Nothing that hard. More like a kind of polite confusion. The face a man makes when he walks into a foreign country and realizes he doesn't speak the language. He recovered quickly. He's well-bred, in the old sense of the word. He complimented the cornbread. He asked me thoughtful questions about my work, but the questions were the kind a tourist asks. Curious about the locals, not curious about himself. Over the years, it got worse, in small ways. He started making little comments at the table about the markets, about how much money some friend of his had made on a single trade, about how the kids today were getting rich from apps and crypto, while the rest of us were still showing up to work at 8 in the morning like fools. He never said welding was foolish. He didn't have to. The shape of the sentence said it for him. Last Thanksgiving was the worst. He'd just gotten a big promotion at his firm. He was managing a fund now, $120 million under his hand. He spent half the meal telling Sarah and me about it, about the deals he was making, about a trip to Zurich he had coming up. At one point, he set down his wine glass and looked across the table at me and said, "Walter, you know what I love about you. You never had to deal with any of this. You just showed up, did your work, and went home. There's a real purity in that." And he smiled. I didn't say anything. I just cut my turkey. Sarah saw my face, though. After Daniel and Eli went to bed that night in the guest room, she came out to the kitchen where I was washing the last of the pans. She stood next to me at the sink and dried while I washed. We didn't talk for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "Daddy, he doesn't mean it the way it sounds. He's proud of you. He just doesn't know how to say it." I told her I knew. I told her not to worry about it. I told her mother used to say that a man's tongue and his heart don't always live on the same street. But the truth is, I lay awake that night for a long time, in the dark, listening to the old house settle. And I thought about my father, about the way he used to come home from the rail yard with his hands black with grease, and how he would scrub them at the kitchen sink with lava soap for 10 minutes before he sat down to dinner, and how he used to say to me, when I was a boy and complaining about something, "Walter, a man who works with his hands is never a poor man. He just has different money." I never told that to Daniel. I didn't think he'd understand. After Sarah's call that Tuesday morning, I sat with my coffee getting cold, and I thought about all of this. And I made a quiet decision, the way old men make decisions without announcing it to anyone. I decided that this Thanksgiving, I wasn't going to let any comment from Daniel get under my skin. Not one. For Sarah's sake. For Eli's sake. I would smile. I would cut my turkey, and I would let the day be what it needed to be. I didn't know yet that the weather was going to make that decision for me. Around 11 that morning, I put on my coat and my work boots, and I went out to the garage. I have a kerosene heater out there that I keep going in the winter because the garage doubles as my workshop, and I don't like cold tools. There's something about picking up a wrench at 20 degrees that takes the joy out of fixing anything. The garage is also where I keep my truck, a 1996 Ford F-150 in a color the dealer called light saddle, which is really just brown. The truck has 240,000 miles on it. I've replaced the transmission once, the alternator twice, and the radiator 3 times. Everything else is original, including, I sometimes think, me. I checked the truck because the weatherman had been talking all week about a storm building out over the Atlantic. A nor'easter, he kept calling it. Like the word itself was supposed to scare us. I've lived through enough nor'easters that the word doesn't scare me much anymore. But I've also lived through enough of them to know you check your truck before one shows up. I topped off the windshield fluid with the winter mix that doesn't freeze. I made sure the spare was holding air. I tested the heater. I checked the jumper cables in the bed. And then, because that's the kind of man I am, I went back into the garage and I checked my tool chest. I want to tell you about the tool chest now, because this story is really about the tool chest more than it's about anything else. It's an old iron chest, about the size of a small footlocker, painted black originally. Though most of the paint is gone now, worn off by 60 years of hands lifting it in and out of trucks. It weighs 40 pounds empty, with the tools in it, closer to 70. It has a heavy iron latch on the front, the old kind, the kind you have to push down and slide. And on the lid, scratched in by hand with the tip of an awl, are 3 letters. H. Henry Hayes, my father. The chest belonged to my father from the day he started at the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1946. He carried it to work for 41 years. When they retired him in 1987, they tried to give him a gold watch. He took the watch and gave it to my mother, but he kept the tool chest. He said the watch was a thing they gave you for what you used to do. The chest was a thing you kept for what you could still do. He gave it to me in the spring of 1989, 3 months before he died. He was in the hospital by then. Heart was giving out. I came to see him after a shift at the mill, and he was sitting up in bed in that thin gown they put on you. And he held my hand, and he told me he wanted me to have the chest. He said he'd put something in the bottom of it for me. I asked him what. He said, "You'll find it when you need it, son. Not before." That was the last real conversation I had with my father. He died 11 days later. I went home that night and I opened the chest. I went through every drawer. I lifted out every wrench, every socket, every gauge. At the very bottom, under a piece of oilcloth, there was a letter, folded in thirds. My name on the outside in his blocky machinist's handwriting, Walter. I almost opened it right there. I almost did. But I thought about what he'd said. You'll find it when you need it. And I thought, maybe today isn't the day. Maybe today I'm just sad and tired and I'd read it wrong. So I put the letter back, under the oilcloth, and I closed the chest. That was 1989. I have not opened that letter in 34 years. I know what some of you are thinking. How could a man have an unread letter from his own dead father and not open it? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. The best answer I can give you is this. As long as I haven't opened it, my father is still talking. As long as I haven't opened it, there's still something between him and me that hasn't been finished. The day I open it is the day the last word gets said, and I haven't been ready for that. Not once. Not in 34 years. Standing in my garage that Tuesday before Thanksgiving, with the snow starting to come down sideways outside the open door, I put my hand flat on the lid of that chest. I felt the cold of the iron through my glove. I felt the rough places where the paint had worn off. And for some reason I couldn't have explained to you, I thought, not today, but maybe soon. Then I went back inside, and I made myself another cup of coffee, and I sat down by the window and I waited for my family to come home. Wednesday came and went. I cleaned the house. Not because it was dirty, but because cleaning the house is what you do the day before company comes. I changed the sheets in the guest room. I set out fresh towels in the bathroom. I made up the little daybed in the sewing room for Eli. because he liked to sleep in there with the window cracked open so he could hear the owls in the woods behind the house. I roasted a pan of squash and made a pot of cranberry sauce from scratch, the way Margaret used to. Whole berries, a stick of cinnamon, the peel of one orange. The kitchen smelled like her by the time I was done, and I had to step outside on the back porch for a few minutes and look at the sky. The sky was the color of an old nickel. The wind had picked up out of the northeast, and it was steady now, not gusting. The dry leaves still clinging to the oaks down by the road were rattling in a way I didn't like. I'd been watching the weather all afternoon. The storm was bigger than they'd thought, coming faster than they'd thought. They were now saying it would make landfall sometime late Thursday night, into Friday morning. They were talking about wind gusts of 70 miles an hour. They were talking about a foot of snow, maybe more. They were using the word historic. I'd lived through historic before. Historic doesn't always mean what they want it to mean. Sometimes historic just means somebody forgot to bring the firewood in. I brought the firewood in, 2 cords, stacked against the back wall of the porch under a tarp, enough to keep the wood stove going for a week if the power went out, which it would. Power always goes out in a real storm out here. I checked my oil lamps, filled them, trimmed the wicks. I keep 3 of them, 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the living room, 1 in the bedroom. They were my mother's, originally. Glass chimneys, brass bases. They've lit this house through every blackout since I built it. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Eli. He's 7 years old, and he can already work a phone better than I can. The text said, in his careful little spelling, "Grandpa, can we go to the basement and look at the tools when we get there?" And then a little picture of a wrench. He must have hunted for that wrench on his phone. The thought of it made me smile in a way I hadn't smiled all week. I texted back, "Yes, sir. First thing after we eat." He sent me back a thumbs up. That boy. I don't know how to tell you about that boy without my voice going somewhere it doesn't usually go. Eli is the closest thing to Margaret I have left in this world. He has her eyes, dark brown with a little green in them in the right light. He has her quiet way of watching a room before he speaks. He has her laugh. Sarah doesn't have her mother's laugh. Somehow it skipped a generation. But Eli does. The first time I heard him laugh, when he was about 2 years old. I was sitting in Sarah's living room, and Daniel was bouncing him on his knee. And Eli laughed, and I had to set down my coffee because my hands were shaking. Eli loves the tool chest. He doesn't know why yet. He's only 7. But every time he comes here, the first thing he wants to do is go down to the basement and have me open the chest and tell him what every tool is for. He likes the heft of the big crescent wrench. He likes the way the brass fittings on the gauges look in the light. He likes the smell of the cutting oil. Last summer he asked me if I would teach him how to weld someday, and I told him yes, but not until he's 12. Because welding without respect for it is how a man loses an eye. He took that seriously. He's a serious boy in the good way. Thursday morning, I was up at 5:30. The wind had backed off some overnight, which I knew was a trick. Storms do that. They take a breath before they come at you. I got the turkey in the oven by 7. I peeled potatoes at the kitchen sink and watched the sky out the window turn from gray to a strange, pale yellow. That yellow sky. I'd seen it before. My father used to call it a snow sky. He said it meant the storm was already on its way and had decided what it was going to do. I had everything ready by 1 o'clock. The turkey resting under foil, the potatoes mashed and keeping warm, the cranberry on the table in Margaret's good crystal dish, the candles lit. I had even put on a clean flannel shirt and a pair of jeans that didn't have any oil on them, which for me is about as dressed up as it gets. At 1:45, I heard Sarah's car coming up the gravel drive. I heard Eli's voice through the closed door before they even got out, hollering, "Grandpa." And I stood there in my own kitchen, in my own house, with my hand on the back of a chair, and I thought, this is the day. Whatever it's going to be, this is the day. I didn't know yet what was coming. I didn't know yet that by midnight tonight, the wind would be screaming, the power would be out, and my son-in-law would be calling me from a flooded basement in a voice I had never heard him use before. I just opened the door, and I let my family in. Eli came through the door first, the way he always does, with his coat half off one shoulder and his cheeks red from the cold, and his arms already coming up for a hug before he was even all the way inside. He hit me at about belly height, his head against my chest, and he held on for a long second. I put my hand on the back of his head and felt how cold his hair was from the few seconds between the car and the porch. And I thought about how every single thing about this child was a thing I would remember on my last day. Sarah came in behind him with a casserole dish in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. She kissed my cheek and said, "It smells like Mom in here." She said it the way she always says it, with her voice catching just a little. And I nodded and took the casserole from her without saying anything, because there isn't anything to say to a sentence like that. Daniel came in last. He was wearing a long charcoal wool coat that hung exactly right on his shoulders the way only expensive coats do, and a cashmere scarf the color of oatmeal, and leather gloves. He stamped the snow off his shoes on the mat and looked around the room with that quick, surveying glance I'd come to know. Then he smiled his careful smile and stuck out his hand. "Walter, good to see you. Place looks great." The place did not look any different than it had looked for 45 years. But I shook his hand, and I thanked him. And I told him there was coffee in the kitchen if he wanted some. He said he was fine. He handed me the bottle of wine he'd brought. It was a French wine. I don't know wine. I can't tell you if it was a good one or not. I set it on the counter and I left it there. We were going to drink iced tea with the turkey, the way Margaret always did. The way I still do. But I didn't say that. We sat down to eat at 3. The light outside was already going gray, which it does in late November in Pennsylvania. I lit the 2 candles on the table and I said the grace my father used to say, short and plain, thanking God for the food and the hands that brought it. Eli watched me say it with that serious look of his. Sarah closed her eyes. Daniel kept his open, but he bowed his head a little, which was something. For about 20 minutes, it was a good Thanksgiving. Eli told me about his school. He had a teacher named Miss Donovan who he loved, and a kid in his class named Jacob who he didn't love. And he was learning multiplication tables, and he could do the 7s. Mostly. Sarah told me about a watercolor class she was taking on Saturday mornings. Daniel was quiet, eating, watching them both. He looked tired. I noticed that. Tireder than I'd ever seen him. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there last year. I didn't say anything about it. A man's tiredness is his own business until he chooses to share it. Then around the third helping of potatoes, Daniel cleared his throat and started in. He didn't mean to. I don't think. It's just what came naturally to him when there was a silence to fill. He started telling us about a friend of his from Princeton who had just sold a tech company for $200 million. $200 million. He said the number twice. He shook his head while he said it, like he couldn't quite believe it himself. Then he looked across the table at me, and he said, "Can you imagine? Walter, $200 million for an app that helps people order coffee faster." I told him I could not imagine that. He laughed. He thought I was making a joke. I wasn't making a joke, but I let him laugh. Sarah caught my eye across the table. I gave her a small nod. I had made my decision 2 days ago, and I was sticking to it. Not one comment was going to get under my skin tonight. Not for me, anyway. For her. Daniel kept going. He told us about the markets, about how the second half of the year had been strange, how a lot of his colleagues were nervous about something he called exposure, whatever that meant. He said it in a way that was supposed to sound casual, like a man who has nothing to worry about. But there was something in his voice, something pulled too tight. I noticed it the way you notice a wrong note in a song you've heard 1,000 times. I didn't say anything. I just cut my turkey. After we ate, Sarah and I cleared the table together. Daniel offered to help, but Sarah waved him off and told him to go watch the game with Eli in the living room. I think she wanted a few minutes alone with me in the kitchen, while we were rinsing plates. She leaned over and she said, very softly, "He's been off lately. Dad. Work stuff. He won't tell me what." I told her men don't always tell their wives the hard things right away. I told her sometimes a man has to work it out in his own head first before he can put it in words. She nodded. She wanted to believe me. I wanted to believe me too. Around 6 o'clock, Eli came into the kitchen with his hands behind his back, like he was hiding a secret. He came right up to me, and he tugged on the leg of my jeans, and he whispered, "Grandpa, can we go to the basement now?" I told him yes. I told him to put his slippers on first, because the basement floor was cold this time of year, and I didn't want him catching anything before the snow even started falling for real. He ran off to find his slippers. I looked at Sarah. She smiled at me, the same way her mother used to smile at me when I did something quiet and good. Then I went to the basement door and I opened it, and I flipped on the light at the top of the stairs, and I waited for my grandson. The basement under this house is the way I left it the day I retired. Concrete floor, painted gray a long time ago. A bare bulb hanging from a chain in the middle of the ceiling. A small high window on the east wall that lets in a little square of light during the day. A workbench along the south wall, with my vises and my grinders and my smaller tools hung on a pegboard above it. And in the corner, on the floor, sitting on a piece of 2x4 to keep it off the concrete, is the tool chest. Eli came down the stairs ahead of me, his hand on the railing because he knew I'd tell him to put it there if he didn't. He stopped at the bottom and looked at the chest the way he always did, with that quiet, serious look. Then he turned to me. "Can you open it, Grandpa?" I walked over to it. I knelt down, which is not as easy as it used to be. I worked the iron latch the way you have to work it, pushing it down and sliding it sideways at the same time, and the lid came up with that small creak it always makes. The smell of cutting oil and old steel came up out of it the way it always does. The same smell that has been in my nose since I was 11 years old. Eli leaned in. He looked at every drawer. He pointed at the big crescent wrench on top. That's a wrench. That's right. That's a crescent 12-inch. What's it for? It's for turning anything you don't have the exact right tool for. It's the tool you use when you can't find the tool. Your great-grandfather used to call it the diplomat, because it makes everybody get along. Eli grinned. He liked that. He always liked the names. I started taking the tools out, one by one, the way I always do when he asks. The pipe wrench, the torch and the striker, the set of brass fittings, polished by my mother 60 years ago and never tarnished since. The small leather pouch with the gauges in it. Eli held each one in both hands. He weighed them. He turned them over. He asked me what each one had been used for, and I told him a story for each one. The pipe wrench was the one I used in the winter of '83 when the main line at the mill froze and we worked 36 hours straight without sleep. The torch was the one my father carried up to the horseshoe curve in '58 to thaw a frozen switch in a blizzard. Every tool had a story. Every story had a man behind it. We were on the brass fittings, with Eli holding one up to the light to see how it shined, when I heard a footstep on the stairs. I didn't turn around right away. I knew who it was. There was only one person in the house who walked like that, with that careful, expensive step. Daniel came halfway down the stairs and stopped. He stood there looking at us. I could see him out of the corner of my eye. He was holding a glass of the French wine he'd brought, the bottle I'd left on the counter. He must have opened it himself. He stood there for a moment, watching me and Eli on the floor next to the open tool chest. Then he came the rest of the way down. "There you are, buddy. I was wondering where you went." Eli held up the brass fitting. "Dad, look, it's brass. Grandpa says his mom polished this when she was a little girl." Daniel glanced at the fitting. He smiled the smile. He looked at the chest. He looked at me, kneeling on the concrete floor in my flannel shirt with grease already on my hands from the cutting oil, even though I'd washed them before dinner. And then he said it. I don't think he meant it the way it came out. I want to believe that, even now. But he said it. "Hey, bud, don't let Grandpa fill your head with too much of this old-fashioned stuff. Okay, you've got a lot of more important things to learn." He said it lightly. He said it with a smile. He even tousled Eli's hair when he said it. But the words went into the air of that basement and they stayed there, hanging, the way a bad smell hangs in a closed room. Eli stopped looking at the brass fitting. He looked up at his father. He looked at me. He didn't know what to do with his face. He was 7 years old. He was just trying to read the room. I didn't say anything. I won't lie to you. There was a thing that started up the back of my neck, hot and old. The kind of thing a man feels when he's been disrespected in his own house in front of his own grandson. But I held it. I held it the way you hold a torch when your hand wants to shake, by locking your wrist and breathing through your nose. I took the brass fitting back from Eli, gently, and I put it in his small hands again, and I closed his fingers around it. "You keep that. I said to him. You hold on to it tonight. You can put it back when you come down here next time. Eli looked at the brass in his hand. He nodded, slowly. I stood up. My knees popped. I closed the lid of the tool chest. Careful and quiet. I worked the latch the other way. Then I turned and I looked at Daniel. I didn't say anything to him either. I just looked at him. I held his eyes for about 3 seconds. That's all. 3 seconds. But I think in those 3 seconds I let him see something I had been hiding for 7 years. I don't know exactly what he saw, but I know what I felt. I felt my father standing behind me. I felt every man in my line who had ever held a tool in his hand to feed a family. I felt them lined up behind me in that basement. Daniel looked away first. He took a sip of his wine. He said, in a voice that was suddenly a little too cheerful, "Well, we should probably get on the road. They're saying the storm's going to come in hard tonight." I told him that sounded like a good idea. They left at 6:45. Sarah hugged me at the door for a long time. She knew. I don't know exactly how much she knew, but she knew. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything about it. She just said, "Drive careful, Daddy. I'll call you when we get home." I told her she was the one driving in, not me, and I told her to drive careful too. She laughed a little, the way you laugh when you don't want to cry, and she went out to the car. Daniel shook my hand at the door. The handshake was firm. He looked me in the eye. He said, "Thank you for the meal, Walter. As always." I told him he was welcome. I told him to get my grandson home safe. He nodded. He picked Eli up and carried him to the car, even though Eli is too big to be carried anymore, and Eli waved at me over his father's shoulder with the brass fitting still in his fist. I watched their taillights disappear down the gravel drive and out onto the county road. Then I closed the door, and I stood in my front hall for a long time. In the quiet. I'll tell you something I've learned about being a widower. The hardest part of any visit isn't the visit. It's the 5 minutes after. The way the house gets too quiet too fast. The way you can still smell the food in the air, but there's no one to share another plate with. I stood in that hallway for what must have been 5 minutes, just listening to the wind starting to pick up outside, and I thought about the look on Eli's face when Daniel said what he said. I thought about how that boy was going to grow up. I thought about whether anything I knew was going to make it down to him, or whether his father's voice was going to be louder than mine in the end. Then I shook it off. A man can stand in his own hallway and feel sorry for himself for 5 minutes. He doesn't get to do it for 6. I went into the kitchen. I started the dishes. I was about halfway through the dishes when the wind shifted. I felt it before I heard it. The house has a way of telling you. The old timbers groan a little. The flue in the wood stove makes a soft whistling sound that it doesn't make in normal weather. I looked up from the sink and out the window. The yellow had gone out of the sky, and now it was black. The kind of black that isn't really black, but is so dark a gray it might as well be. The first snow was coming down sideways past the kitchen window, fast, and I could hear the wind moving up the side of the house with that low, building roar that meant business. The nor'easter was here. I dried my hands. I went into the living room and I built up the fire in the wood stove. I put on 2 big oak splits, dampered it down so it would burn slow and long. I lit the oil lamp in the kitchen and turned off the overhead light, just to save the bulb. because I knew the power was going to go any minute. I lit the oil lamp in the living room too. The house got warmer and lower and older with the oil lamps going. It looked the way it had looked in 1979, before we put the overhead fixtures in. At 7:52, the power went out. I heard the refrigerator give its small, dying sigh in the kitchen. I heard the porch light click off. The whole house went down to oil lamp light and the orange glow from the wood stove. I sat down in my chair by the fire, and I picked up the book I'd been reading. A paperback Western I'd read 3 times before. And I tried to read it. I couldn't read it. The wind was loud now, loud and steady. I could hear something banging out in the yard, probably the latch on the shed door, which I hadn't quite gotten right last summer. I was going to have to fix that latch. I was going to have to fix it before another winter went by. At 8:15, my phone rang. It was Sarah. I knew before I picked it up that something was wrong. A daughter doesn't call her father at 8:15 on Thanksgiving night in a blizzard just to say goodnight. I picked up on the second ring. Sarah. Daddy! Her voice was high and tight and shaking. Daddy, the heat's gone out, and there's water everywhere, and Daniel doesn't know what to do, and Eli's crying because he's cold, and I called every plumber in the book, and nobody is coming out in this. Daddy, nobody. I stood up out of my chair. I was already walking toward the closet by the front door before she even finished the sentence. Sarah, listen to me. Slow down. Tell me where the water is. She said it was in the basement. She said the main heating line had burst. There was water coming up through the floor vent. The whole basement floor was already a couple of inches deep. The heat had gone out maybe 10 minutes ago. The house was already starting to get cold. She said Daniel had tried to find the shutoff valve, but he didn't know where it was. And the power was out, so he was using the flashlight on his phone. And his phone was down to 18% because they hadn't charged it before the power went. I told her I was coming. She started to cry then. She said, Daddy, you can't. The roads are bad. Please don't. I just wanted to ask you what to do. I told her I knew what to do. I told her to put Eli in the heaviest coat he had and to wrap him in a blanket on the couch. I told her to tell Daniel to go to the basement and stand by the boiler and not touch anything. I told her I would be there in 45 minutes. She said, Daddy. I said, Sarah, I'm coming. I hung up. I put on my insulated coveralls. I put on my winter boots. I put on the Carhartt jacket Margaret bought me for Christmas in 2006. The one that has a tear in the right elbow that I've never had patched because it's still warm and that's all a jacket has to be. I put on the wool hat my father gave me when I was 22. I put on a pair of leather gloves and stuffed a second pair in my pocket because gloves get wet and a man with 2 pairs of gloves can work twice as long. Then I went down to the basement. I picked up the tool chest, 40 pounds. With the tools, 70. I lifted it the way I'd lifted it 1,000 times. With my legs, not my back. Because the day a man lifts with his back is the day a man stops being able to work. I carried it up the stairs and out the front door and across the porch and out to the truck. I set it in the bed and I lashed it down with the bungees I keep there for this exact reason. Then I went back to the porch and I grabbed 2 extra things I wanted. A small spool of copper pipe, the 1/2-inch kind I use for repair work, and a coil of pipe insulation. Both of those went into the truck bed, too. The wind hit me in the face the whole time I was loading. It was coming out of the northeast at what felt like 50 miles an hour, with gusts that staggered me a little when I stepped off the porch. The snow was coming sideways. It was already a couple of inches deep on the gravel drive. The truck was going to be slow. I got in. I turned the key. The old Ford started on the first try, the way it always does, because I take care of it. I let it run for 30 seconds to warm up. Then I put it in gear and I started down the drive. The county road was bad. Not the worst I've ever seen, but bad. The snow was coming so hard the headlights only reached about 30 feet. The plows had been out earlier, but the wind was filling everything back in faster than they could clear it. I drove at about 20 miles an hour, both hands on the wheel, leaning forward a little to see. The wipers were doing the best they could. The defrost was on full. I could see my breath fogging on the inside of the windshield around the edges. 2 miles. That's how far it is from my house to Sarah's house. 2 miles of country road. Then a quarter mile through their development. On a normal night. 6 minutes. Tonight, I figured 30, maybe 40. I drove past the Stoltzfus farm. The big white house was dark, the way every house was dark tonight. I drove past the old one-room schoolhouse that they don't use anymore but that the county won't tear down. I drove past the cemetery where my mother and father are buried, side by side, under a single granite stone that says Hayes across the top of it. I always slow down when I pass that cemetery, even in good weather. Tonight I slowed down too. I couldn't see the stone from the road in the snow, but I knew where it was. I always know where it is. I want to tell you what I was thinking on that drive, because it matters. I was not thinking about being a hero. I want to be clear about that. I was not thinking about proving anything to Daniel. I was not thinking about the look on his face in my basement 2 hours earlier. I had let that go, in the way an old man lets things go, by setting them down on a shelf in the back of his mind and walking away from the shelf. What I was thinking about was Eli, cold, on a couch in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, crying, 7 years old. My grandson, my Margaret's grandson. And I was thinking about my father. I don't know why my father came into my head on that drive, but he did. I thought about the night of the Great Pennsylvania Blizzard in 1958, when I was 3 years old and the snow was as deep as my father's waist. The power had been out for 2 days. The phones were down. My mother was running a fever. Bad. The kind of fever that doesn't break on its own. And my father put on his coat and his hat and he picked up his tool chest. The same tool chest that was now bouncing in the bed of my truck. And he walked 4 miles through the snow to fetch the country doctor. I didn't remember it myself. I was too young. My mother told me, years later. She told me my father walked 4 miles each way through that snow. She told me when he came back with the doctor at 3 a.m, he had ice frozen in his beard and his fingers were white at the tips. And he didn't say anything to anyone. He just put down the tool chest, sat down by the stove, and waited for the doctor to come back out of the bedroom. That was the kind of man my father was. He didn't make speeches about it. He just went. I gripped the wheel a little tighter, and I kept driving. The wind was hitting the side of the truck hard now. The snow was coming so thick I almost missed the turn into Sarah's development. I made it. Slow. I drove through the silent rows of dark houses, the upscale houses, the big ones with the 3-car garages and the stone fronts. Not a single window was lit. Not one. I saw their house at the end of the cul-de-sac. There was a faint, jumping light moving in one of the downstairs windows. Flashlight. Sarah was waiting in the front window with it. She must have seen my headlights coming up the street, because the front door opened before I even pulled into the driveway. I parked the truck. I shut it off. I sat there for 1 second in the cab, in the dark, with the wind shaking the truck on its springs, and I put my hand flat on the dashboard, the way some men say a prayer. Then I got out. I went around to the bed. I unhooked the bungees. I lifted the tool chest down. 40 pounds of iron and 70 pounds of memory. And I carried my father's chest up to my son-in-law's front door. Sarah was at the door before I made it to the porch. She had a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a flashlight in one hand. She was barefoot. I almost said something about that, about her being barefoot on a stone porch in a blizzard. But I didn't. There are times to correct your daughter, and there are times to just walk past her into the house and start working. This was the second kind. She held the door for me. I stepped past her into the front hall. The house was already cold, not freezing yet, but the kind of cold that gets into a house quick when the heat dies and the wind is pulling the warmth out through every window sill. I could see my breath a little, faint, in the beam of her flashlight. "Daddy." "Where's Eli?" On the couch in the living room. He's wrapped up. He stopped crying about 10 minutes ago. He's almost asleep. "Good. Don't wake him. Where's Daniel?" In the basement. I set the tool chest down on the marble floor of the front hall. The chest was wet from the snow. It left a small dark mark on the marble. Sarah saw me notice it. She put her hand on my arm. "Daddy, the floor doesn't matter." I looked at her. I told her I knew. I told her I was glad she said it. I asked her where the basement door was. She pointed down the hall, past the kitchen. I walked through her kitchen. It was a beautiful kitchen. I'll say that. The kind of kitchen with the white cabinets that go all the way to the ceiling, and the heavy stone countertop, and the big farmhouse sink that has never seen an actual farm. The flashlight beam jumped across all of it and made it look like a kitchen in a magazine that someone had taken a photograph of by accident, in the dark. I found the basement door. It was open. There was a flashlight beam down at the bottom of the stairs, moving around in a small, panicked circle. I could hear water, the sound of running water, but slower. The way water sounds when it's coming up through a floor instead of out of a faucet. I stood at the top of the stairs and I called down, "Daniel." The flashlight beam jerked. It came up the stairs and hit me in the face. I held up a hand. The beam dropped. "Walter." Oh, thank God. "Walter, I don't know what to do. The water keeps coming. I can't find the shutoff. I tried. I looked everywhere." His voice was not the voice I knew. It was the voice of a man who has been losing for a while, and just realized it. It was high. It was thin. It was the voice my own voice used to be when I was 23, and I'd done something wrong at the mill, and the foreman was on his way over to see it. I told him to come up to me. I told him to come up slow because the stairs were going to be wet at the bottom. He came up. He had his phone in one hand, the flashlight on, and his other hand on the railing. He was wearing his Thanksgiving clothes still, a blue dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, wool trousers, leather shoes. The shoes were soaked through. The cuffs of his trousers were dark with water for the first 6 inches. His hair, which is usually combed back the way men in his line of work comb their hair, was hanging in his eyes. He was shivering, not pretending, really shivering. He came up to the top of the stairs and he stopped in front of me. He was a couple of inches taller than I am, but standing there in his wet shoes with his hand still on the railing, he didn't look taller. He looked young. He looked like a boy who had wandered too far from his own porch. He opened his mouth. He was going to apologize, I think, or explain, or both. I didn't want him to do either one. There wasn't time for it. And even if there had been, it wasn't the moment. I cut him off, not unkind, just clear. Daniel, listen. I need you to do exactly what I tell you, in the order I tell you. We are not going to talk about anything else until that boiler is fixed and that water is off. Are you with me? He nodded. Fast. He nodded the way a man nods when he is grateful to have somebody else doing the thinking for a minute. Yes, yes, Walter. Whatever you say. Go upstairs. Get me every towel you've got. The biggest ones. Stack them by the basement door. Then go to the kitchen. Boil a kettle on the gas stove if your stove is gas. Is your stove gas? It's gas. Good. Boil 2 kettles. Bring them to the basement door, but don't carry them down. Set them at the top of the stairs. I'll tell you when. Then go sit with Sarah and Eli in the living room. Keep that boy warm. That's your job tonight. Keep that boy warm. Do you understand me? He nodded again. He turned to go. Then he stopped. He turned back. He looked at the tool chest on the floor at the end of the hall. He looked at it for maybe 2 seconds. Then he looked at me. Walter, thank you for coming. He said it different than he'd ever said anything to me. There was no smile on it. There was no audience for it. It was just the words, said straight, by a man who needed somebody and had run out of better options. I told him he was welcome. I told him to go on. He went. I walked back to the front hall and I picked up the tool chest. I carried it down the hall to the basement door. I set it down at the top of the stairs, and I opened the latch and I lifted the lid. I pulled out my big flashlight, the heavy one, the mag light that takes 4D batteries and that my father gave me for my 40th birthday. I clicked it on. The beam was strong and white. It cut down into the basement and showed me what I was working with. The basement was finished. Carpet on the floor, a pool table in the middle of the room, a leather sectional along one wall, a big television mounted above a stone fireplace that was decorative, not real. The carpet was dark with water from one end of the room to the other. I could see the water still moving across it, slow, coming from the door to the utility room on the far side. I started down the stairs. Halfway down, I stopped. I put my hand on the railing. I closed my eyes for 1 second. I said something to my father. I don't usually do that. I'm not the kind of man who talks to his dead out loud. But I did it then. I said. "Dad, walk with me on this one." I didn't expect an answer. I didn't get one. I didn't need one. Sometimes saying it is the answer. Then I opened my eyes and I went down the rest of the way. And I went to work. The water at the bottom of the stairs came up over the tops of my boots. Cold. So cold it took my breath away for a second through the insulation. I waded across the carpet toward the utility room door. The water was moving, slow but steady, in the direction of the lowest point of the floor, which was over by the sectional. The leather sectional was going to be ruined. I noted that and I kept walking. There would be time later for what was ruined. There wasn't time now. The utility room door was already open. The flashlight beam went in ahead of me. I saw what I was working with right away. The boiler was a high-efficiency natural gas unit, the kind that costs about $8,000 and is supposed to be smarter than a man. The kind that talks to a thermostat on your phone. It had a digital display on the front that was dark, because the power was out, which meant the brain of the thing was off and it didn't know what to do with itself. The main supply line going into the boiler ran along the ceiling, came down the wall behind it, and went into the unit through a copper coupling. Halfway down that wall, there was a section of pipe that had a split in it about 4 inches long, running with the grain of the copper. The split was wide enough that I could see daylight through it, if there had been any daylight. Water was coming out of it in a steady stream, hitting the top of the boiler and running down the sides and pooling on the concrete floor of the utility room. I'd seen this exact failure 100 times, maybe 200. It's what happens when a pipe in a partially heated space gets cold for a few hours. The water inside expands as it freezes. The copper can't stretch fast enough, and the pipe lets go along the weakest line in the metal. By the time you find it, the ice has usually thawed and you've got an open pipe pouring at line pressure, which is what I was looking at. The first thing was the shutoff. I waded over to the wall behind the boiler. I traced the supply line back with the flashlight. The main water shutoff for the house was where they always are in a basement like this, about 18 inches up from the floor, on the wall where the main came in from outside. There was a brass gate valve with a round handle on it. I could see right away why Daniel hadn't found it. There was a piece of finished drywall covering most of that wall, with a small access panel cut into it that someone had painted over and never marked. From the outside, it just looked like a slightly off square of wall. You'd have to know what you were looking at. I took out my utility knife. I scored around the painted edge of the panel. I worked the blade in and popped the panel out. There was the valve. I put my hand on the handle. The handle didn't want to move. They never do, in houses where nobody has ever closed the main since the day it was installed. I put my weight on it. Slow. Steady. Don't snap a valve stem in a flood. The handle gave a quarter turn, then a half. Then it eased the rest of the way around. The sound of running water in the utility room dropped from a steady hiss to a slowing trickle. In about 30 seconds, the trickle stopped. I stood there in the dark, in the cold, in the water up to my shins, and I listened to the silence. That's the moment a plumber lives for. When the noise stops, it doesn't last, because there's still all the work to do. But for about 3 seconds, when the water stops moving, you can feel the house relax around you. Then I got to work. I went back to the bottom of the stairs, and I yelled up, "Daniel!" He was there fast. The flashlight beam came down the stairs. Yeah. Bring me the chest. Carry it with both hands. Keep your back straight. Watch the bottom 3 steps. They're wet. He came down. He carried the chest the way I told him. He came across the water in his ruined leather shoes without saying a word about them. He set the chest down on top of the pool table, which was the only dry surface in the basement. The felt on the pool table was already going to be ruined from the humidity. It didn't matter what we put on top of it now. I opened the chest. I took out what I needed, and I laid it out on the felt next to the chest. The propane torch and the striker, the flux brush and the can of paste flux, the roll of lead-free solder, the tubing cutter, the deburring tool, a short length of half-inch copper pipe, which I had brought from home, 2 copper couplings, a pair of channel locks, a clean rag. Daniel watched me lay it all out. He stood there with the flashlight in both hands, holding it the way he'd hold a bouquet of flowers, pointed at the pool table so I could see what I was doing. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask any questions. He just watched. I want to tell you what was happening in his face while he watched, because I could see it, even though he didn't know I could. He was seeing the tools laid out on the felt of his pool table. He was seeing the propane torch, which is a tool he had probably never held in his life. He was seeing the practiced way I sorted the fittings by size with my fingers without looking at them, and I could see him doing math in his head. He was a man who lived by math. He was running numbers. He was trying to figure out, I think, what a person had to know to do what I was about to do. And I think the number was bigger than he expected. I didn't say anything to him about it. I just picked up the tubing cutter, and I walked back into the utility room. The split section of pipe was up against the wall about chest high, which was a mercy, because it meant I could work standing up instead of on my back on the wet floor. I held the flashlight in my teeth for a second, the way you do when you need both hands and there's nobody to hold the light. And I marked 2 points on the pipe, 1 an inch above the top of the split, 1 an inch below the bottom of it. Then I took the tubing cutter and I clamped it on at the upper mark. You don't cut copper pipe. You score it. You wrap the cutter around it. You tighten the thumb screw a quarter turn. You spin the cutter around the pipe 1 full revolution. And you tighten the thumb screw another quarter turn. You keep spinning and tightening until the pipe parts on its own. Done right. The cut is square and clean, and the inside of the pipe is round, which matters because round is what a solder joint needs. Done wrong? You get an oval, and an oval doesn't seat right against a fitting, and your joint leaks, and you do the whole thing over. I did it right. The first cut took about 40 seconds. The bad section dropped down onto the wet floor with a small splash. I made the second cut at the lower mark. The pipe was now in 2 pieces with a clean gap between them, about 6 inches, sized to take the new piece I'd brought. I picked up the deburring tool and I cleaned the inside edge of both cuts. Then I took the small piece of new pipe and I cut it to length with the same cutter, and I deburred both ends of it too. Daniel was still holding the flashlight. He'd moved with me. He hadn't said a word in maybe 10 minutes. I glanced at him once. His face was different. He was watching the way a child watches when something is happening that he doesn't understand, but knows is important. The smile was gone. The polite mask was gone. He looked, for the first time in 7 years, like a person I could have a conversation with. I picked up the flux brush. I dipped it in the can of paste flux. I painted the outside of both pipe ends on the wall and the outside of both ends of the new piece, and I painted the inside of the 2 copper couplings. Flux is what makes the solder run. Without it, the solder just balls up and rolls off the metal. With it, the solder gets pulled down into the joint by capillary action and seals it for life. I picked up the torch. I took out the striker. I clicked the striker once, twice, and the torch lit on the second click with that small, soft whoosh that has always sounded to me like one of the most peaceful sounds in the world. I adjusted the flame down to a clean blue cone. I picked up the first coupling. I slid it onto the upper end of the pipe coming down from the ceiling. I slid the new piece into the bottom of the coupling and brought it up to meet the upper line. Then I brought the second coupling down from the new piece to the lower end of the line that ran into the boiler. Everything seated tight. Everything fit. Now the soldering. I want you to understand something about soldering copper. It looks easy, and it isn't. The metal has to be hot enough to melt the solder on its own. If you put the solder on with the flame, the joint won't seal. The heat has to come from the metal. So you play the flame across the fitting, not across the solder, and you watch for the flux to go from white to clear. You watch for the surface of the copper to turn a particular soft brown color that I can't describe in a way that would make sense to a man who has never seen it. And then you touch the tip of the solder to the seam. And if the metal is hot enough, the solder disappears into the joint, and you walk the solder around the seam, and you stop, and you let it cool, and you have a joint that will outlive you. I did the first joint, the flame, the weight, the brown color, the touch of the solder, the small silver line all the way around the seam, done in about 90 seconds. I moved up to the second joint. Same thing. Then up to the third. Same thing. When I was done, I shut off the torch. I let it cool on the concrete next to me. I picked up the rag and I wiped the joints clean. Then I stood back and I looked at the work. 3 clean solder joints on a new piece of copper in a section of supply line in a stranger's basement, by oil lamp, in a blizzard. I won't lie. I felt something in my chest just then. Not pride exactly. Something older than pride. Something like, this is the thing I have been doing my whole life, and I can still do it. And tonight it is going to keep my grandson warm. I turned to Daniel. All right, let's open the main back up. I walked back to the access panel. I put my hand on the brass handle of the gate valve. I turned it slow. A quarter turn. I waited. I listened. No hissing. A half turn. I waited. I listened. No hissing. All the way open. I waited a full 30 seconds, watching the new joints, watching the floor under them. Nothing. Dry. The system was holding. But we weren't done. The boiler still needed to be relit. And that was its own job. And in a power outage with a high-efficiency unit that has an electronic ignition, it doesn't just start back up on its own when the power comes back. There's a sequence to it. You have to bleed the air out of the lines. You have to manually reset the ignition. You have to make sure the gas valve has cycled. And before any of that, you have to make sure the power is coming back. As if the storm itself had been listening. Just then, I heard the refrigerator on the floor above us hum. Not loud, just a soft, familiar sound. The power had come back on. Daniel heard it too. He looked up at the ceiling. He looked at me. I told him to go upstairs. I told him to check on Sarah and Eli. I told him to leave the boiler to me. He started to argue, just a little, and then he stopped, and he nodded, and he handed me the flashlight, and he went up the stairs. I worked on the boiler for another 20 minutes by myself. I bled the lines. I cycled the gas valve manually. I held the reset on the electronic ignition until I heard the soft thunk of the burner catching. The unit came up. The display glowed green. The little fan inside kicked on. I put my hand on the top of the unit, and I felt it start to warm. Within 5 minutes, I could hear the circulating pump pushing hot water up through the lines and out into the radiators on the floor above me. The house was going to be warm again in about 20 minutes. I picked up my tools. I put them back in the chest, each one in its place, the way my father had taught me to do at the end of every job. A man who can't put his tools away clean has no business taking them out. I closed the lid. I worked the latch. And I sat down for 1 second on the edge of the pool table, and I let my back rest. Because my back had been working hard, and I'm 68 years old, and the body keeps its own count. Then I picked up the chest. I picked up the flashlight, and I went upstairs. The living room was warmer than the basement, but not by much yet. It would take time. Sarah had built up a small fire in the gas fireplace, the kind you turn on with a switch on the wall, and Eli was asleep on the sectional under 3 blankets, with his cheeks pink and his mouth a little open, the way kids sleep when they've finally gone all the way under. Sarah was sitting on the floor next to him with her hand on his foot through the blanket. Daniel was standing by the front window, looking out at the snow, his back to the room. I set the tool chest down by the door. I didn't say anything for a minute. I just looked at my grandson sleeping. Then Sarah looked up at me and she said, in a whisper, "Daddy, thank you." I told her not to thank me. I told her to go upstairs and put dry clothes on and get warm. I told her I'd sit with Eli. She started to protest, and I shook my head and pointed at the stairs. She knew better than to argue. She kissed Eli on the forehead, and she went up. Daniel stayed at the window. I went into the kitchen and I poured myself a glass of water from the tap, because the tap was working again. And I drank the whole glass, standing there in the dark with the flashlight off. The power was back, but I hadn't turned on any of the overhead lights yet. The fire from the living room was enough. When I came back into the living room, Daniel had turned around. He was looking at me. He had his hands in the pockets of his wool trousers. His shirt was still wet and stuck to him. His hair was a mess. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years in the last 3 hours. He said, "Walter, can I make you a cup of coffee?" It was such a small sentence, such a small offer, but he said it the way a man says something when he doesn't quite know how to say a bigger thing, and he's hoping the small thing will get him close enough. I told him yes. I told him I'd like that. He went into the kitchen. I heard him filling the kettle. I heard him opening cabinets, trying to find where Sarah kept the coffee. He didn't know where the coffee was in his own house. I noted that. I didn't say anything about it. I sat down on the floor next to the sectional, with my back against it, near Eli's feet. I was tired. I'm not going to lie. I felt every one of my 68 years in that moment. My knees were complaining. My back was complaining. My shoulders, where I'd been holding the torch up at chest height, were complaining loudest of all. But I was warm, and the house was warm, and my grandson was breathing slow and easy, and I had done what I came to do. Daniel came back about 10 minutes later with 2 mugs. He handed me one, black coffee, which he must have guessed at, and he guessed right. He sat down on the floor across from me, with his back against the front of an armchair. He held his mug in both hands. He looked at the fire. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The wind was still going hard outside. I could hear it pushing against the big front windows. I could hear the soft tick of the radiators coming up to temperature. I could hear Eli breathing. Then Daniel said, very quietly, I want to say something, but I don't know how to start it. I told him to just start it. I told him the start didn't matter. I told him most of the things worth saying don't have a good beginning. They just have a middle that you have to walk into. He nodded. He took a breath. He took another one. And then he started. He told me he'd been disrespectful to me for 7 years. He used that word, disrespectful. He told me he knew it. He told me he'd known it the whole time, in some part of himself, but he'd had reasons for not facing it. He told me the reasons were not good ones. He told me he had grown up in a house where his father had measured every man on earth by his bank account, and his father had measured him the same way. And even though he hated being measured like that, he had grown up to do it to other people. He told me he had done it to me. He told me he had done it the first time he walked into my house, and he had done it every Thanksgiving since. He said the word sorry. He didn't say it once. He said it 3 or 4 times, in different shapes, in the way a man says it when one time doesn't feel like enough. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't say it was fine, because it had not been fine. I didn't say it didn't matter, because it had mattered. I just sat there on the floor of his living room, with my back against the sectional and my coffee in my hand, and I let the man say what he needed to say. When he was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, and there's something else. There's another thing I need to say to you. I haven't said it to anyone. I haven't said it to Sarah. I waited. He looked into his coffee. He didn't look up at me. He said, the fund I run, it's in trouble. We're in real trouble. I made a call in May that went the wrong way, and I doubled down on it in June because I was sure it was going to come back. It didn't come back. By the end of August, I had lost about 40% of the fund. I should have closed it then. I didn't. I made another call in September. I doubled down again. I lost another 30%. We are down 68% for the year. We are going to have to tell the investors. There are people, Walter, there are real people in that fund. There's a fire department pension out of Scranton. There's a guy I went to school with whose mother put her retirement money in. There are people. He stopped. He put his hand over his mouth. He sat there with his hand over his mouth for a long time. His shoulders were shaking. He wasn't making any sound. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it surprised me. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel any small, dark satisfaction at the rich man falling on his face in front of the welder. I want to say that because somebody listening to this might think I would have, and I want to be honest with you. I did not feel that. Not a drop of it. What I felt was pity. The clean, plain pity one man feels for another man who has gotten himself somewhere he doesn't know how to get out of. The same pity I would have felt for a kid at the mill who I saw mess up his first weld and burn through a pipe. The same pity I felt 40 years ago for a co-worker who showed up to a shutdown drunk and got himself fired in front of everybody. Pity. And under the pity, something gentler. The thought that this man, this stranger I had been trying to read for 7 years, was finally showing me his face. I didn't say anything for a long time. I let the silence do what silence does, which is most of the work of any real conversation. When I did speak, I spoke quiet, because Eli was sleeping 6 feet away, and because some things are quiet things. I asked Daniel a question. I asked him if he had done anything illegal. He shook his head. He said no. He said the calls had been within his authority. He said his fund agreement gave him the discretion to make the trades he had made. He said no laws were broken. He said he had simply been wrong. I asked him a second question. I asked him if he had been hiding anything from the investors. He thought about that one. He took his time. Then he said no. He said the monthly statements had gone out, on time, with the real numbers. He said the investors knew the fund was down. They just didn't know how bad it was about to get when he had to liquidate the last positions and lock in the losses. I asked him a third question. I asked him what was stopping him from going to the investors tomorrow morning, sitting down with each of them, looking them in the eye, and telling them the whole truth. He looked at me. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Shame, Walter. Shame is what's stopping me. I went to Princeton. I went to Wharton. I run a fund. I'm supposed to know better than this. I've spent 10 years building a reputation as a man who doesn't lose, and now I have to walk into rooms and tell those people that I lost almost 70% of what they trusted me with." I nodded. I drank some of my coffee. I set the mug down on the floor next to me. And then I said the only thing I think I had to say. I said it slow, and I said it once, because some things you don't repeat. Daniel, I'm going to tell you something my father told me when I was about 26 years old. I had made a mistake at the mill. I had welded a fitting on a high-pressure line, and I had welded it wrong. I caught it myself, before the test. But I had to go tell the foreman. And I was scared to do it. I was scared because I was new and I thought it was going to end my career. I went home that night before I told anyone, and I told my father about it. And my father set down his fork, and he looked at me across the supper table, and he said, "Walter, a man's reputation isn't what people think he is. A man's reputation is what people find out he is when something goes wrong. You go in there tomorrow, and you tell that foreman exactly what happened. And you do not hide one single piece of it. And then you let the chips fall." I took a breath. I went in the next morning. I told the foreman. He took me down to the line. We cut out the bad weld together, and I redid it under his eye. He never wrote me up. He never said another word about it. 12 years later, when he retired, he wrote me a recommendation letter for the pipeline job up north. He said in that letter that I was the most honest welder he'd ever worked with. He said when something went wrong on my line, I came and told him before he had to come and find me. That letter got me a job that paid me 40% more than I'd ever made. That letter put my daughter through college. I looked at him. You go to those people. You go tomorrow morning, or the morning after, as soon as the roads are clear. You sit down with each one. You tell them the whole thing. You don't hide a number. You don't smooth anything over. You tell them what you did and why you did it, and how much they're going to lose. And then you ask them, what can I do to make this right going forward? And you listen to what they say, and you do what they ask, if you can. Not because it will save your fund. It won't. The fund is gone. But because you are not gone. You are still standing in this room. And the man you are going to be for the next 40 years starts the morning you make that decision. Daniel didn't say anything for a long time. His head was down. His coffee was getting cold in his hands. The fire was crackling soft in the fireplace. The wind was easing a little outside. I could hear it. The worst of the storm had passed over. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He said, "What if I lose everything? What if they sue? What if I lose the firm? What if I lose the house?" I told him, "You might lose all of that. You might lose more than that. But you will not lose the only thing that matters. You will not lose the part of yourself that knows you did the right thing." He nodded, slow. Then he said, "Walter, I have been a damn fool about you for 7 years." I told him I knew. I told him I knew, and it was all right. And we were going to start fresh from tonight. And we were not going to talk about the last 7 years again. Because the last 7 years were over and a man doesn't carry over what he doesn't need to carry over. He started to cry then. Not big, just quiet. He put his hand over his eyes. His shoulders shook a little. And I did something I hadn't done in 7 years. I reached across the rug between us. I put my hand on his shoulder, my old, scarred, calloused hand. I left it there. I didn't pat him. I didn't say anything more. I just held my hand on his shoulder, and I let him cry. After a while, the crying stopped. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at me, and he said, "Can I ask you one more thing?" I told him he could. He said, "Will you stay tonight? Will you sleep in the guest room? I don't want you driving back in this. And I don't want you to go." I told him yes. I told him I would stay. Sarah came down the stairs about 10 minutes later in dry sweatpants and a heavy sweater, with her hair pulled back. She saw Daniel sitting on the floor with his eyes red, and she saw me sitting on the floor across from him with the empty coffee mug at my elbow. And I think she understood, without anyone telling her, that something had happened in that room while she was upstairs. She didn't ask. She just came over, and she sat down on the rug between us. And she leaned her head on my shoulder, and she put her hand on Daniel's knee. We sat there like that for a long time. 3 people on the floor of a living room in a finished house in a Pennsylvania suburb at almost 1 o'clock in the morning, with a 7-year-old boy sleeping on the couch behind us and a tool chest sitting by the door. I'll tell you something. I have lived a long time. I have stood in some big rooms. I have been to my wedding and to my parents' funerals and to the birth of my daughter and to the birth of my grandson. I have stood on the deck of a tanker in the Gulf of Alaska at sunrise. I have welded a joint on a pipeline at 30 below zero with the northern lights overhead. I have held my wife's hand the morning she died. That moment on the floor of Sarah's living room was one of the quietest big moments of my life. There was no music to it. There was no speech. It was just three people in a warm house, sitting close, having come through something together. After a while, Sarah said, "Daddy, you must be exhausted. Let me get the guest room ready for you." I told her I'd help her with the sheets. We went up together. She got the linens out of the hall closet and we made the bed in the guest room. While we were tucking in the corners, she looked at me across the bed and she said, "Daddy, what happened down there?" I told her she should ask Daniel. I told her it wasn't my story to tell. I told her husband had something he wanted to tell her, and he was going to tell her. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. But he was going to tell her. And when he did, I wanted her to remember that the man who told it to her was a different man than the one who had sat at my Thanksgiving table 8 hours ago. She nodded. She didn't push. She has her mother's instinct for when to wait. She hugged me at the door of the guest room. She held on tight. Then she went back downstairs to her husband. I closed the door of the guest room. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I took off my coveralls. I took off my insulated shirt. I had a wool undershirt on under that, and I left it on. I took off my socks, which were wet, and I hung them over the radiator under the window. I lay down on my back on the bed with my hands folded across my chest, the way my mother used to lie down at the end of a long day. I looked up at the ceiling. The ceiling was white and smooth and unfamiliar. I thought about my father. I thought about him a lot in that hour, lying in the dark in my son-in-law's guest room. I thought about the way he used to come home from the rail yard. I thought about the smell of his hands, the diesel and the steel and the lava soap. I thought about the night he walked 4 miles through the snow for the doctor and never once told the story himself. I thought about the day he handed me the tool chest in the hospital and said, "You'll find it when you need it." I had needed it tonight. I had needed it for a different reason than I'd ever needed it before. I had needed it not for the tools, but for the weight of it, for what it meant to lift it, for the fact that when I carried it up to my son-in-law's front door, I wasn't carrying it alone. My father was carrying it with me. His father, who I never met. The coal miner from Wilkes Barre was carrying it with me. Every man in my line, going all the way back to whatever country we came from before there was a record of us, was carrying it with me. I thought, maybe tomorrow morning. Maybe tomorrow morning is the day I open the letter. I didn't decide for sure. I just let the thought sit there. Then I closed my eyes. The last thing I remember before I fell asleep was the sound of the radiators ticking and the sound of the wind outside, easing now, almost gentle. And under both of those sounds, the soft sound of my daughter's voice from downstairs, talking quietly to her husband. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. I slept. I slept the way a man sleeps when he has done the thing he was put on earth to do. When I woke up in the morning, the storm was over. The sun was coming up over the snow, and my whole life had changed. I just didn't know yet how much. I woke up at 6:13 in the morning. I know it was 6:13 because I looked at the clock on the nightstand, and the numbers were back, glowing green in the dark room, which meant the power had stayed on through the night. I lay there for a minute before I sat up. The room was warm. The sound of the wind was gone. I could hear, very faint, the sound of a plow scraping somewhere out on the main road. I sat up. My back made the small clicking sound it always makes when it's been on a strange mattress. I put my feet on the floor. The carpet under my feet was thick and unfamiliar. Margaret and I never had carpet that thick. Margaret used to say carpet that thick was for people who never spilled anything. I walked to the window and I pulled the curtain back. The world outside was white. Just white. The trees were white. The driveways were white. The cars in the driveways were small, soft, white shapes that didn't look like cars anymore. The sky was a pale, clean blue. The kind of blue you only see the morning after a real storm. The sun was just up over the line of houses across the cul-de-sac. The light coming off the snow was so bright I had to squint at it. I stood there at the window for a long time. There is something about the morning after a hard night. The world has a way of looking new in a way it doesn't have to earn. I got dressed. My coveralls had dried by the radiator. My socks, too. I put them on. I made the bed. The way I always make a bed when I sleep somewhere that isn't mine, with the corners tucked. I went downstairs. The house was quiet. Daniel and Sarah were still asleep. I could see the closed door of their bedroom from the bottom of the stairs. Eli was still on the sectional, but somebody had carried him there, blankets and pillows, in the night, and he was burrowed down deep, only the top of his head showing. I went into the kitchen. I made coffee. I made enough for everyone, in the big pot on the counter, because I figured we'd all want some when the others got up. While the coffee was brewing, I stood at the kitchen window and I looked out at the backyard. There was a single set of tracks across the yard. Some animal, maybe a fox. The tracks came out from under the deck, crossed the snow in a long, careful line, and disappeared into the hedge at the back of the property. Some living thing had moved across that yard while we slept, doing its own work, following its own line. I stood there with my hands on the counter and I watched the tracks for a while. When the coffee was done, I poured myself a cup. I took it out to the front porch. Daniel had left his coat and a pair of boots by the door, and I borrowed the boots, which were a half size too big but close enough. I stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit my face, but it was a clean cold now, not a moving cold. The storm was over. I stood there on the porch, and I sipped my coffee, and I looked at my truck, parked crooked in the driveway with 8 inches of snow on the hood. I thought about the letter. I thought about it the way I had thought about it for 34 years, carefully, with a kind of held breath in the back of my mind. I thought, today is the day. I thought, no, maybe not today. Maybe tomorrow. I thought, what am I waiting for? I thought, I have been waiting for the right hour, and now I think the right hour has been here for a while, and I just didn't recognize it. I went back into the house. I drove home around 8 o'clock. Sarah was up by then, in the kitchen, and she hugged me hard at the door, and she told me Daniel was still asleep, but he had told her everything last night before he went to bed. She didn't tell me what he had said. She didn't need to. Her face told me. She had cried about it. She had also, I could see, decided that they were going to come through it. She and her husband were going to come through it together. She put her hand on my cheek before I left, and she said, "Daddy." You saved more than the pipes last night." I told her she was being dramatic. She laughed and she said, "Daddy, sometimes the dramatic thing is the true thing." She kissed me on the forehead. I left. The roads were better than I expected. The plows had been through twice. The county knows what it's doing when a nor'easter blows out. I drove home slow anyway, and I passed the cemetery again. And this time the sun was on the headstones, and I could see the granite where Hayes is cut into it. I slowed down. I tipped my hat at the stone, the way my father used to tip his hat at his own father's stone when we'd drive by it. Then I drove on. I pulled into my own drive at 20 after 8. The bird feeder was still there. It was nearly empty. I'd been gone less than 12 hours and the chickadees had cleaned it out. I went into the garage and I scooped a coffee can full of seed out of the bin, and I went around the side of the house and I filled the feeder. The chickadees came back before I'd even put the lid on the can. They came in pairs, the way they do, small and quick and brave for their size. I stood there in the snow next to the feeder. I watched them for a minute, and I said, out loud, to nobody, but a little bit to Margaret, "All right, I'm going to do it today." Then I went into the house. I took off my coveralls. I poured myself another cup of coffee, and I went down the stairs to the basement to open the chest. The chest was where I'd left it, on the 2x4 in the corner. I knelt down in front of it. My knees still didn't like it, but they had stopped complaining out loud. I worked the iron latch. I lifted the lid. I emptied the chest. I took out every drawer. I took out the tools I hadn't used last night, and the ones I had. The crescent wrench, the pipe wrench, the set of brass fittings, the leather pouch with the gauges, the cutting oil, the smaller torches, the spare striker. I laid them all out on the workbench behind me. By the time I was done, the chest was empty, just the iron walls of it, and the bottom, which had the oilcloth on it. I lifted the oilcloth. The letter was there, right where my father had put it in the spring of 1989. The paper was yellow now, yellower than it had been 34 years ago. The folds were sharper. The ink on the outside, where my name was written in his blocky machinist's hand, had faded a little, but you could still read it. Walter. I picked it up. I sat down on the floor of the basement, with my back against the wall under the workbench. I held the letter in my lap for a long time. I'm not going to lie to you about that. I held it for maybe 10 minutes before I opened it. I needed those 10 minutes. I had been alone with the idea of this letter for half my life. The thing in my hand was about to become an actual thing instead of an idea. And once you open a letter, you can't unopen it. You can't put a word back into a man's mouth after he has set it on a page. After 10 minutes, I unfolded it. There were 2 pages, both written in pencil, in his hand. The hand of a man who had spent 41 years making careful marks on paper with a stub of pencil from a railroad foreman's pocket. The lines were straight. The letters were square. The writing slanted a little to the right. I read it twice. The first time, I read it fast, because I wanted to see all of it before I let any of it sink in. The second time, I read it slow, one line at a time, the way you should read a letter from your father. I want to share it with you. I'll read it the way he wrote it, as best I can. He didn't address it to anyone. It just started. Walter. By the time you read this, I am gone, and you have opened the chest because there is something you needed to find. Maybe you needed a tool. Maybe you needed a piece of fitting. Maybe you just needed to sit with the chest for a while. It doesn't matter. You are reading it now. So I am going to say what I wanted to say to you while you were not yet old enough to hear it. I want to tell you what the chest is. The chest is not a toolbox. A toolbox is a place where a man keeps the things he uses to make money. The chest is a place where a man keeps the things he uses to take care of people. There is a difference. Most men, when they are young, do not see the difference. They look at the chest, and they see the tools, and they think the tools are the point. The tools are not the point. The point is who you carry the chest for. I carried this chest for my father. He carried it before me in the mines. I carried it for my mother and my sisters in the lean years. I carried it for your mother. I carried it for you. I have never, in 53 years of carrying this chest, picked it up for myself. Every single time I picked it up because somebody else needed me to. That is the only reason a man picks up a chest like this one. If you pick it up for any other reason, you will end up putting it down again, and the tools will rust. You are reading this, and you are sad, and I am sorry for that. You should not be sad for long. I had a long life. I worked good work. I loved your mother, and I love you. There is no piece of unfinished business between you and me. I want you to know that. I am at peace. Now I want to tell you one last thing. I want you to listen to this part the closest. There is going to come a time in your life when you are going to have to teach a man what this chest means. Maybe a son. Maybe a son-in-law. Maybe a grandson. Maybe somebody else. Somebody you don't even know yet. You will know it is the time because the other man will be in trouble, and he will not know how to ask for help, and you will see him looking at the chest and not understanding what he is looking at. When that happens, Walter, you do not lecture him. You do not preach at him. You pick up the chest, and you go, and you do the work in front of him, and you let the chest do the talking. The chest has more to say than you do. It always will. I love you, son. Keep the chest oiled. Keep the latch working. Pass it on when the time comes. And do not be afraid of the storm. Storms are how God reminds us what we were made for. Your father, Henry Hayes. I sat on the floor of my basement for a long time after I finished reading. The letter was in my lap. The light from the small high window on the east wall was coming in at an angle now, the way it does at 9 in the morning. There was a small square of sun moving slow across the concrete floor. I cried. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I sat on the floor of my basement and I cried the way a 68-year-old man cries, which is not loud. It is just a wet thing in the eyes and a tightness in the chest and the slow breath in and out. I cried for my father. I cried because I had carried the chest for him last night, without knowing that was what I was doing. I cried because he had known. He had known, sitting in that hospital bed in 1989, that there was going to be a night, decades after he was gone, when his only son would pick up the chest in a storm and carry it through the snow to save the family of a man who didn't yet know he needed saving. He had known. He had written the letter for that night, and he had trusted me to find it when I needed it. not before. I sat there for a while longer. The square of sun moved past my foot. Then I folded the letter back up. I put it back in the bottom of the chest. I put the oilcloth back over it. I put the tools back, one by one, each one in its place. I closed the lid. I worked the latch. And I went upstairs to make myself some breakfast. The next weeks went by the way weeks go when something big has happened. Quiet on the outside, loud on the inside. Daniel did what I told him to do. He waited 2 days for the roads to clear, and then on the Monday after Thanksgiving, he drove into the city, and he sat down with the senior partner at his firm, and he told him the whole story. He didn't soften it. He didn't make excuses. He laid it out. The partner heard him out. Then they spent the next 3 days, the two of them and a compliance officer, putting together a plan to notify every investor by the end of the week. They scheduled meetings. Daniel did them in person whenever he could, by phone when he couldn't. I know all this because Daniel called me. He called me every night that week. He'd come home, and he'd put Eli to bed, and then he'd go out to his car in the driveway, and he'd sit there in the dark, and he'd call me. I'd sit in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I'd listen. Sometimes he just needed to talk. Sometimes he just needed to hear me breathe. I told him a few things, here and there, when there was something to say. Mostly I listened. The fire department pension out of Scranton sued. I'd expected that. They had a fiduciary duty to their members, and they had to do it. Daniel didn't fight them. He met with their lawyers, and he gave them everything. He helped them put their case together against his own firm. The firm settled in February for an amount that took a big bite out of the firm's reserves, but did not bankrupt them. Daniel was let go. They didn't fire him exactly. It was a mutual separation. He walked out of the office on a Friday afternoon in late February with a cardboard box of his personal things, and he drove home, and he sat down at his kitchen table, and he told Sarah he didn't know what he was going to do next. She told him they were going to be all right. She told him she had been thinking about it, and she had a couple of ideas, and they would talk through them tonight after Eli was in bed. She told him she loved him. She told him she was proud of him for the way he had handled it. I heard all this from Sarah, who called me on a Saturday morning while she was driving Eli to a hockey practice. She told me her husband was different. She told me he was sleeping better than he had in 2 years. She told me he had taken up running, of all things. She told me he had asked her if she thought it would be all right if he started coming up to my house on Saturday mornings to help me with whatever I had going on. I told her, of course. I told her I'd been waiting for him to ask. He started coming up the first Saturday in March. He drove out in his own car, an expensive German thing that had a heated steering wheel, but he wore old jeans and a barn jacket he'd bought at a farm supply store. The first Saturday, I had him sand and reseal the bench on the back porch. The second Saturday, I had him help me replace the screen on the storm door, which had been torn since June and which I had been letting wait. The third Saturday, I had him under the truck with me, holding a flashlight, while I changed the oil. He held the flashlight steady. He didn't say much. He watched. On the fourth Saturday, while we were eating lunch at my kitchen table, sandwiches I had made out of leftover meatloaf, he set down his sandwich and he said, "Walter, can I ask you something?" I told him he could. He said, "What did your father do when he didn't know what to do?" I thought about it. I chewed for a while. Then I told him my father, when he didn't know what to do, would do three things. First, he would do the next small thing in front of him, whatever it was. If there were dishes to wash, he washed them. If there was wood to split, he split it. He never tried to think his way out of confusion by sitting in a chair. He moved his hands. Second, he would talk to my mother about it, in plain language, without trying to look like he had it figured out. He treated my mother like a partner. He told her his fears. He listened to hers. Third, he would pray, not in church, not out loud. He would say his prayers in his head while he worked. He would tell God what he was afraid of, and he would ask for help. And then he would shut up and keep working. Daniel listened. He nodded. Then he asked me what he should do next, in his life, with no job and a lawsuit settled, and a savings account that was going to last about 14 months if they were careful. I told him I didn't know what he should do next. I told him I wasn't the man to ask about quantitative finance. But I told him this. I told him there were a lot of small companies in this country that were being run by men who had built them with their hands and who were getting old and who didn't have anybody to leave them to. Family companies, plumbing supply houses, small fabrication shops, specialty welding outfits, machine shops, companies that made things or fixed things or moved things, companies that had 10 or 20 or 30 employees and a real customer base and books that were a mess because the owner had never learned bookkeeping. I told him those companies needed somebody who understood money and who also understood people who worked with their hands. I told him most men who understood money looked down on those companies, and most men who worked with their hands didn't understand money, and there was a gap there that a man like him, on the other side of what he had been through, might be uniquely suited to stand in. He looked at me. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Walter, that might be the best thing anybody has ever said to me." I told him I doubted that. I told him he should eat his sandwich before it got cold, even though it was a sandwich and it was already cold. He laughed. He ate his sandwich. We didn't talk about it again that day. But 6 weeks later, he and Sarah came up for dinner on a Sunday night, and Daniel told me he had bought, with what was left of their savings and a small loan from a community bank, a 30% stake in a family-owned welding shop outside of Lancaster, 22 employees, most of them men in their 50s, books that hadn't been updated since 2018. The previous owner, a man named Carl Brubaker, had run it for 41 years and was ready to slow down. Daniel was going to be the new general manager. Carl was going to stay on for 2 years to teach him the trade. Daniel told me all this at my kitchen table, with a glass of iced tea in his hand, while Eli ran around the backyard chasing a barn cat that didn't live with me but visited regular. I told him I was proud of him. He looked at me. His eyes got wet for a second. He looked down at his iced tea. He said, "Walter, nobody has ever said that to me before. Not my own father. Not anybody." I told him I knew. I told him that's why I said it. Spring came hard that year, late, the way it sometimes is in Pennsylvania, then all at once. The snow was gone by the 3rd week of March. The crocuses came up by the daffodils on the south side of the house. The apple tree out back, the one Margaret and I planted in '86, set its buds. By the 2nd week of April, the field behind my house was green, and the chickadees had been joined by goldfinches at the feeder. and the small things that mean spring around here were happening one after another. Eli's birthday is April 22nd. He turned 8 that spring. Sarah called me 3 weeks ahead of time and asked if I would have everyone up for a cookout. The big yard, the apple tree, the picnic table I'd built out of the leftover oak from when I roofed the porch. She wanted a small day, just the 4 of us. I told her that sounded right. The week before the birthday, I went down to the basement and I sat with the chest for a while. I thought about it. Then I went upstairs and I called Sarah and I told her there was something I wanted to do at the cookout. And I told her what it was. And I asked her if she thought Eli was old enough. She was quiet for a second on the phone. Then she said, "Daddy, he's been ready for that since he was 4. You just weren't." She laughed when she said it, but she also wasn't joking. She had her mother's way of saying the true thing without making a fuss about it. The day of the birthday was warm, 72 degrees by noon. The kind of April day in Pennsylvania that feels like a gift. The sky was so blue it looked painted. I got up at 5:30 and I started a fire in the small pit by the picnic table. And I let it burn down to coals over the course of the morning, the way you do for steak. I made potato salad the way Margaret used to, with the mustard and the dill. I cut up watermelon, which Eli loved, even though watermelon in April in Pennsylvania is a crime against good fruit. They got there at noon. Eli came running across the yard before Sarah had even gotten Daniel's car door open. He was carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. He came up to me and he held it out. "Grandpa, I got you a present." I told him it was his birthday, not mine. He told me he knew, but he had wanted to give me a present anyway. He had used his own money. He had bought it at the hardware store on Main Street. I opened the box. Inside was a small can of light machine oil, the kind I use on the hinges of doors and on the latch of the tool chest, the little brass nozzle on top. I looked at it. I looked at him. He said, "Mom told me you said the latch on the chest was getting hard to work, so I got you the oil." I didn't say anything for a second. My throat was doing something it doesn't usually do. I knelt down on one knee in the grass. I put my hand on his shoulder. I told him it was the best present I had been given in a long time, and that I would use it that very afternoon, and that I would think of him every time I oiled the latch from now until the day I died. He smiled. He hugged me around the neck. Then he ran off to climb the apple tree, the way kids do, when a moment has been just exactly as much as they can take. We had lunch, steaks on the grill, potato salad, watermelon, sweet tea. Daniel and I drank coffee after, sitting on the back porch in the rocking chairs. Sarah lay in the grass with Eli, looking up at the clouds, finding shapes. The afternoon was easy. The afternoon was the kind of afternoon a man hopes for at the end of a hard winter. Around 3 o'clock, I told everyone I had something I wanted to show Eli in the basement. Sarah looked at me. Daniel looked at her. They both followed me and Eli into the house, down the stairs. The basement was dim and cool, the way it is in April, with the small, high window throwing a square of sun across the concrete. The chest sat in its corner on the 2x4. I had cleaned it that morning, wiped it down with an oiled rag, the way my father used to do it on the first warm day of every spring. The iron walls of it glowed dull and dark in the light. Eli walked right up to it. He knew the chest. He had been visiting it since he was 4 years old. He looked back at me. I told him to open it. He worked the latch with both hands, the way a kid does, with his tongue between his teeth, concentrating. The latch had been hard to work for years, but this morning, before they came, I had oiled it with 3 drops from the can I keep on the workbench, the one Eli could not have known about. The latch slid open easy under his hands. He pushed the lid up. I knelt down next to him. I took out the oilcloth from the bottom. I took out the letter. I unfolded it. I held it in my lap. Then I said, to all 3 of them, I want to read you something my father wrote a long time ago. And I read the letter out loud. I read it slow. I read it the way Henry Hayes had written it, line by line, in his blocky pencil hand. I read the part about the chest not being a toolbox. I read the part about who you carry the chest for. I read the part about my father carrying the chest for his father, for his mother and his sisters, for my mother, for me. I read the part about how a man does not pick up a chest like this one for himself, only for somebody else. I read the part about how there would come a time in my life when I would have to teach a man what the chest meant. I read the part about not being afraid of the storm. When I was done, the basement was very quiet. Sarah was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Daniel was sitting on the bottom step of the stairs with his hands folded between his knees. Eli was looking at me with his serious face, taking it all in. I folded the letter. I held it out to Eli. I said, Eli, this chest belonged to my father, who you never met, and to his father before him, who I never met. Your great-grandfather wrote this letter for the day a man in our family was going to need to read it. I read it for the first time this winter. I am giving it to you now, because the letter belongs to whoever is going to carry the chest next, and that is you. Not yet. You are 8 years old, but the chest is yours from today. I will keep it for you here in this basement. You can come and visit it any time you want, when you are old enough. When your father says you are ready, you will take it home with you. And one day, a long time from now, you will read this letter to a child of your own. That is how the chest moves. That is how it has always moved. Eli took the letter. He held it carefully. He looked at it for a long time. He looked up at me. He said, Grandpa, am I allowed to read it now? I told him to take his time with it, because his great-grandfather had taken his time with it, and a letter like that should be read slow, the way it was written. He sat down right there on the concrete floor of my basement. He spread the letter out across his small knees, and he started to read it, his lips moving silent, his small finger tracing along under the lines where the words were too long for him. I looked up at Daniel. He was looking at me. His eyes were wet. He nodded at me, very small, the way a man nods when there is nothing to say. I nodded back. I want to tell you what I felt in that basement that afternoon, and then I will let you go. I felt my father. I felt him in the room. I felt my mother. I felt Margaret. I felt all of them, standing close, watching their boy read the letter for the first time. I am not a man who talks about things like that, usually. I am not a man who claims to feel the presence of the dead. But I am going to tell you the truth tonight. They were there, all 4 of them, not as ghosts, as something quieter and bigger than ghosts, as a kind of weight in the air, the way the chest itself is a weight when you pick it up. They were there. And I thought, my father knew. He knew when he was lying in that hospital bed in '89 that this afternoon was coming. He didn't know my grandson's name. He didn't know about the storm. He didn't know about Daniel or Sarah or any of it. But he knew. He knew that I would carry the chest for somebody who needed it, and that somebody would then make himself worthy of the chest, and that a child would one day sit on the floor of this very basement and read the letter for the first time, and the line would go on. He knew. The way men of his kind know things, not by figuring them out, but by trusting that the work, done right, finds the people it was meant for. Eli finished reading. He folded the letter the way I had folded it. He handed it back to me. He said, "Grandpa, I think I'm going to need to read it again when I am bigger." I told him that was the right answer. I put the letter back in the chest, under the oilcloth. I closed the lid. I worked the latch. The latch moved easy on the 3 drops of oil I'd put in it that morning, the morning of my grandson's 8th birthday, on the new can of oil that was sitting on my workbench, the can he had bought me with his own money at the hardware store on Main Street. We went back upstairs. We finished the cookout. Eli climbed the apple tree again. Daniel and I sat in the rocking chairs on the back porch and watched the sun go down behind the field. And we didn't say much, but we sat close. Sarah came out and sat on the step at our feet, and she leaned her back against my legs, and she let me put my hand on the top of her head, the way I used to do when she was 8 years old herself. That was a year and a half ago now. Daniel still runs the welding shop outside of Lancaster. The business is doing well. He has hired 3 more men. He paid off the bank loan a year ahead of schedule. He has not bought a new suit in 2 years. He wears Carhartts to work most days, and steel-toed boots, and a wool watch cap when it's cold. He has calluses on his hands. He has lost the polite smile. The smile he uses now is a different smile. It's smaller. It's truer. It's the smile of a man who has found out what he was for. Sarah has gone back to her watercolor class. She has had 2 paintings in a small show at the gallery in town. The one of the apple tree in my backyard sold. She gave me the check. I gave it back to her. We did that for a while until she finally just framed the receipt and hung it in her kitchen. Eli is 9 now. He comes up to my house on Saturdays. He helps me oil the chest. He has started learning the names of all the fittings. He has started asking when he can hold the torch. I told him 12. We are counting down. Margaret would have loved every minute of it. I know that. I think she does know it. Somehow. I don't claim to know how that part works. I just know that there are nights when I sit by the wood stove with a book in my lap, and I am not lonely. There are nights when the house is full, even when nobody is in it but me. Margaret used to say that love doesn't leave a house. It just changes form. She used to say that. I didn't fully understand it when she said it. I think I am starting to. And here is the part I want to say to you. The part that is the whole point of why I told you this story. I am 68 years old. I have lived through a lot. I have watched the country change in ways that some of you have watched too. I have watched a lot of men measure themselves by the wrong things. I have watched a lot of boys grow up to be men who don't know what they are for. I have watched some good things go out of style. I have watched a few good things come back. I cannot tell you what the country is going to be like in 20 years. I cannot tell you what your own son-in-law is going to be like at the next Thanksgiving. I cannot tell you whether the storm coming for you is going to be a storm of weather, or a storm of work, or a storm of family, or some other kind of storm I have never seen. I cannot tell you any of that. But I can tell you this. Keep your tools sharp. Keep your latches oiled. Keep your fire laid. Keep your truck running. Keep your bird feeder full. Keep the names of your dead in your mouth, and the names of your living too. Be the man who picks up the chest when the call comes. Don't make a speech about it. Don't expect a thank you. Don't keep score. Just go. Because the storm is going to come. It always does. And the man who has done the small work every day, when nobody was watching, is the man who is ready when the storm gets here. And when you carry the chest through the snow to someone who needs you, you are not carrying it alone. You are carrying it with every man and every woman who carried something for you when you were small. You are carrying it with them. They are with you in the dark. They are walking beside you in the wind. They have not gone anywhere. That's what I have to tell you tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sitting with an old welder from Lancaster County for a couple of hours, while he told you a story about a tool chest and a storm and a son-in-law who came around. I know there are a lot of other things you could have been doing. I am grateful you spent this time with me. If this story spoke to you, even a little, I'd be much obliged if you'd give it a thumbs up, or share it with somebody you love, or subscribe so we can sit together again sometime. There are more stories where this one came from. I am not done telling them. I don't think I'll ever be done. And if you are praying tonight, say a prayer for the men and women in your life who carried something for you when you were small. The ones still here, and the ones gone on ahead. They are part of why you are sitting where you are sitting. They are part of the chest. God bless you. God bless your family. God bless the hands that take care of the people you love. Good night, friends. Drive careful out there, and keep your chest oiled.